Welcome everyone to our first virtual SAIAB seminar for 2022. I'm Nikki James, I'm a senior scientist here at SAIAB. Before we start our seminar, there's some house rules. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions during the talk. You'll see the Q&A functions next to the chat function. The questions will be answered at the end of the talk, and please can you all remain muted throughout the talk. Our speaker today is Professor Alan Whitfield, who is an inspiration to all of us. Alan is SAIAB's Emeritus Chief Scientist. He started at SAIAB when it was still the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology in 1987, and he retired in 2018. Alan is an internationally acclaimed estuarine ecologist with a particular interest in the biology and ecology of fishes within estuaries. For his contribution to South African marine science, he was awarded the Gilchrist Memorial Medal, and for his contribution to African aquatic science, the Sussex Gold Medal. He is an honorary professor at Rhodes University and a fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa. During his career, he has published 222 papers and book chapters, more than 60 reports, and delivered more than 120 conference presentations. In a recent analysis of 70 years of research on South African estuaries, Alan was identified as the most productive author on South African estuaries, with the most papers and the most citations. In 2019, Alan published a major synthesis on the biology and ecology of fishes in South African estuaries, and this synthesis, together with his earlier 1998 edition, is used by estuarine ecologists like myself as our go-to book on fish and estuaries. This year, Alan was the lead author and editor of a 2-volume book published by Wiley entitled Fish and Fisheries in Estuaries, A Global Perspective, which he will tell you about today. I'm sure that this 2-volume book will become the go-to text for estuarine ecologists globally. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Nikki. And while I'm saying thank yous, I'd also like to thank Lucky Lamini for organizing this session. He's been assisted by Underseely class. And then Vanessa Rohani has been very busy with email advertising of the talk. So to all three of you, thank you very much. I'm now going to share my screen with you, which will be on the book. Okay, I think I better start at the beginning with this book, and it's had quite a long genesis, going back more than 20 years. The idea originally came about when Mike Elliott and myself were visiting Steve Blaber in Australia. We were all part of delegates to a conference there, and over, I think it was a lunchtime discussion, we talked about doing a global book on estuaries, fish and estuaries. Both Steve and Mike at that stage had produced books on tropical estuaries in the case of Steve, and Mike had done a book on the fishes of European estuaries. The publisher in the case of Steve was Blackwell's, and in the case of Mike was Wiley. And one of the ideas we had was we'd produce this global book which would be published by Wiley Blackwell because the two companies had merged. And it meant that we could then use text, figures, tables without any infringement of copyright in this global book. And the reason we wanted to do a global book is because there wasn't a global book on fishes and estuaries available. So this was going to be a first. We also realized a little bit later that we needed to have better coverage from the American estuaries, and then we invited Ken Abel to join us, and that's how the 4 editors that you see there on the cover of the book arose. We were both editors and authors. I think all of us were lead authors on at least one chapter in the book, but we invited large number of other authors from around the world. And we ended up, I think, with 52 authors and co-authors altogether. including some South African authors and co-authors. The chair of this session, Nikki James, is on the climate change chapter. Nadine Stradum is on the fish recruitment and habitat usage chapter as a co-author. Paul Cowley was a lead author of the conservation chapter, and then he was a co-author also on the fisheries chapter. Steve Lambeth was on the management chapter. So there was quite a good South African representation of authors in the actual book itself, which was good to see. So we initially thought that maybe a one volume would be what would happen. But in the end, it actually ended up, once the book had started growing beyond 1,000 pages, Wiley Blackwell said, no, it's best to go for a 2-volume work, which is what happened. And you can see the covers of the 2 volumes there. And I chose one picture from the Southern Hemisphere. It's a South African estuary. And there's a Northern Hemisphere estuary from North America as well. So we had the 2 hemispheres represented on the covers of the book. Now, if you look at the content of the book, it's different from the previous volumes that I was talking about, in that we had a number of new chapters which weren't really well represented in those earlier volumes. So connectivity was a big issue in the more recent time. Climate change was also something that wasn't on the radar screen of those earlier volumes. And we allocated an entire chapter to those 2 topics. The occurrence of non-native fishes in estuaries is also a relatively young science in estuaries. And of course, that's now extended to non-native plants and invertebrates as well. That chapter wasn't very large, but we obtained the cooperation of a couple of authors from North America who were involved in non-native fish research, particularly in California. And they were responsible for pulling that chapter together. But it also highlighted that there's a lot of work still to be done on non-native fishes and estuaries around the world. The chapter on chapter 13 is one, if you do get hold of the book and you don't want to wade through all the chapters, go straight to chapter 13, which is a summary chapter led by Mike Elliott. And it contains the major findings of each of the previous 12 chapters in a relatively condensed form. And it also looks at future research directions, which I'm sure many of you will be interested in going forward. Then something that we brought up right at the beginning, this was 20 years ago, was the inclusion of study methods. We felt that study methods are a very useful tool for not only new students and graduates who are entering the estuarine fish research field, but even the senior scientists would find it useful, both in terms of field equipment sampling methods and then data processing, analysis, and interpretation. So those 2 appendices are fairly substantial. In fact, they're full chapters in their own right. And we included them to make a total of, let's say, 15 altogether chapters that the book comprises. Now, what I'm going to do in the next half hour is basically I've selected 20 slides, or 20 figures from the book. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of them, just to give you a flavor of what the book is all about and what it addresses. There's no ways that in half an hour I can cover the entire book in any detail whatsoever. So I'd rather cover individual figures in a little bit more detail. And as I say, you'll get a feel of what the book is about from these figures. So the first one is a figure which summarizes the question, how dependent are fishes on estuaries? It's a question that scientists from the very early days were asked. Okay, so these fishes use estuaries as nurseries and they're important areas from that perspective, but how dependent are fish on these estuaries? If the estuaries all were destroyed or closed up and were not available, would the fish who use estuaries as nursery areas be able to use alternative nursery areas? And over the decades, we've accumulated a significant amount of information on individual species, such that we've been able to group the fish into different guilds according to their dependence on estuaries. So from the bottom left-hand corner there, you have low abundance of marine stragglers and freshwater stragglers in estuaries in terms of numbers. There might be quite a significant number of species, but there are low numbers of actual individuals. And you go right up to the top right-hand corner, where you have high abundance of the species that are relatively dependent on estuaries or strongly associated with estuaries. So you've got this gradation of association that takes place as you move from non-dependence to dependence of fish on particular estuaries. And that was informed to a certain extent by looking at the life cycles of individual species and then using that information to form the guilds, which we've covered quite comprehensively in the book. And here you can see that there are a wide variety of life history styles by fishers that use estuaries. And it's no means a closed book, because there's a little blank spot there in the bottom right-hand corner waiting for someone to come up with a new life history style by some species that hasn't been well studied up until now. And then we can complete a nice little figure on that. But it's important to know that this work, this basic work, has now informed the ability to conduct guild analyses and things like that, which was not possible before the research on these individual species has been undertaken. And then that leads to the ability to look in different regions of the world and look at the composition of guilds. And here 5 main guilds are looked at in terms of the European and Mediterranean context. And you can see that the percentage contribution of species to these different guilds is not the same in different areas. It varies, it changes. And that when we start looking at the management of systems and things like that, we need to take these differences into account. This was a figure drawn up in Ken Abel's chapter, and it illustrates very clearly that the fish habitats and the utilization of estuaries by fishes is a very, very complex thing. And scientists who go into this field often get locked into 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of those blocks that you see around around the central square. No scientist is an expert in every single block, and yet to have a proper understanding of fish habitats and the utilization of estuaries by fishers, in theory, you actually need to have good information from every single one of those blocks in order to have a comprehensive information, because the drivers of fish in estuaries is both biotic, which is the right-hand column labeled as an ecological context in this diagram, and the more abiotic characteristics, which is on the left-hand side of the diagram, and also the top, the physicochemical variables. And so we've got experts in some of those different fields, but they don't have an overall expertise in all the different fields. And at the end of the day, when we come to model estuaries in a detailed manner, we're going to require information from all those blocks, and there's a lot of work still to be done in order to get to that level. Once we establish that estuaries are very important nursery areas for fishes, and that marine species were dominant in most estuaries, there was a strong focus on looking at the recruitment of larval and early juvenile fish into estuaries. And that strategy appears to change as the fish develops from an egg and larval stage through to an early juvenile. And I'm very proud to say that some of our scientists, such as Nikki, who's chairing the session, and Nadine Stradum at Nelson Mandela University, have been very prominent in this research. Nikki particularly with olfactory cues influencing fish recruitment into estuaries by marine species, and Nadine and Paula Patrick have been very involved in looking at both recruitment and also the swimming abilities, which I'll show in another slide just now, of these larval fish, which is quite surprising. And here's that slide. It's not from Paula or Nadine's their work, but they did studies similar to this, looking at the ability of these early larvae or late larvae and early juveniles in terms of their swimming abilities. And you'll see that on the horizontal axis is the length of the fish in millimeters, and you'll see that at about 10 millimeters, which is the size at which these small fish actually first come into estuaries, they've got quite a reasonable swimming ability. And in fact, the swimming speed in centimeters per second is approaching 10 centimeters per second of these little fish that are only 10 millimeters long. And the other important factor is how long can they swim at that speed. And if you look at the solid curve, which is an exponential curve going up to the right, you'll see that between 10 millimeters and 13 millimeters, these fish are able to swim at these sustained speeds for 10 to 15 kilometers. So it's a long distance that they can swim. And this is the time that they're actually starting to migrate towards the shore and into estuaries, sometimes along the coast in the surf zone. And they need these strong swimming abilities. And it was only as a result of the work of people like Nadine and Paula that we became to realize that these fish are in fact very strong swimmers for their size, and that they've got terrific endurance. They're marathon swimmers. Once they get into an estuary, obviously there's nursery functions that are performed by different habitats in estuaries around the world, and the ones that have received the most attention are the seagrass meadows, the salt marshes, and the mangrove forests. And often the communities in those different habitats are not the same. So you have different species assemblages using different plant habitats, literal plant habitats, as nursery areas. Perhaps the one type of plant habitat which hasn't been as well studied are reed beds. Maybe I'm biased here because reed beds are quite a prominent feature in many of the subtropical estuaries around our coast. And they do also occur in estuaries in other parts of the world. But up until now, the fish fauna associated with these reed beds hasn't been as well studied as the seagrasses, salt marshes, and the mangrove forests. Also of importance is the temporal availability of these habitats as a result of tides. So on the right-hand side, you can see two clocks in the top of each of those figures. The one is a salt marsh estuary, where you can see the actual salt marsh itself is not available for occupation by the fish for a very long time, whereas the seagrass beds, which are in the intertidal and subtidal area, are much more readily available as nursery areas for fish. And similarly with your mangrove forest in the lower right-hand diagram, you will see that the clock indicates that the mangroves themselves are only available for a very short time to fish occupation by the small juvenile fish, whereas again, the seagrass beds are readily available for much of the time. Something that's a common denominator from both the North American estuaries, in this case, Chesapeake Bay. So this information here, which indicates the striped bass abundance in Chesapeake Bay in relation to essentially river flow, okay? So it's the nutrients that are being put into the bay. As they increase, the productivity of the bay increases, and then perhaps it's not surprising, but the catch per seine haul of the striped bass also goes up. And we've got exactly replicate types of graphs from the Eastern Cape showing marine opportunist species increasing in abundance in those estuaries in the Eastern Cape that have reasonable and increasing river flow, as opposed to those estuaries where the river flow has dissipated altogether. And it indicated that, and it indicates that river flow and freshwater flow into estuaries is not wasted, as some farmers might have us believe, and that in fact the productivity of estuaries is closely related with river flow into estuaries and is a vital component of estuaries. it's also been shown in recent years that in the marine environment, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, Steve Lambert's work has been shown quite clearly that the river flow into the coastal zone of KwaZulu-Natal has a significant impact on the productivity of the marine recreational fisheries in that area. So I suppose we can look at the recent floods that have occurred in KwaZulu-Natal and anticipate that in about 3 or 4 years' time, there's going to be a bumper crop of marine fish species available to recreational and commercial fishers in that province. One of the early detailed studies that were conducted by a large number of estuarine ichthyologists when I first started were dietary studies. And many of the scientists worked on the feeding ecology, the food and feeding ecology of this species, and then that species, and then the next species, or this family of species. And it was very important to get this information. But what I think a lot of us overlooked in our studies was that we didn't take the full life cycle of the fish into account. In other words, we either studied juveniles because that was the component that was present in the estuaries. The adults were mainly in the marine environment, and somebody else would do the feeding ecology in the marine environment on the adults. And very few studies actually followed the feeding of the fish from the larval stage right through to the adult stage. And you can see even in this diagram here, the juveniles, when they're very small, are feeding on copepods and crustacean larvae, and they carry on feeding on those two components right up to almost adulthood. And when they become adults, they no longer feed on crustacean larvae or copepods at all. What we haven't got in this diagram, unfortunately, is what were the larvae feeding on? And did they ever consume detritus, polychaetes, as is shown by some of the early juveniles? We don't have that information. And really, to get a comprehensive knowledge of a species, you really do need to know what they feed on from literally hatching to death. And that information isn't always available. So even with feeding studies, the door's not closed to further work that still needs to be done. Perhaps one of the more important trophic studies, feeding studies, was that undertaken when isotopes, stable isotopes, first became available. And this is the work from a diagram from Angus Patterson's PhD that was used in the book. And it was basically looking at the Kariga estuary trophic functioning and where the carbon was coming from. So using stable carbon isotopes, Angus was able to ascertain that there were different pathways, different carbon pathways in the channel of the estuary versus the littoral areas of the estuary in terms of what were the primary producers actually producing the detritus, which was then feeding into the detritus food chain of the fish in that estuary. And bear in mind that when in the earlier feeding studies that we did, we couldn't distinguish where the detritus was coming from, whether it was detritus that had emanated from the terrestrial environment, from salt marshes, from seagrass beds, whereas the advent of stable carbon isotopes and other isotopes as well gave us a much better insight into the functioning of trophic functioning of estuaries. And nowadays, with the new fatty acid analyses and that, we've gone to a whole new array of methods that can be used in this regard. This is a diagram that was very interesting and was included in the book because it shows how the integration of trophic functioning from the primary producers, in fact, from the nutrients, right through the primary producers to, in this case, the plankton food chain. So what we're looking at here is the plankton food chain in the Sacramento estuary over a period of time. So we've got a pre-1982 era, which was dominated by diatoms. And you can see that during that period, the nitrates and the phosphates were dominant in the ecosystem. And that resulted in a certain fish community composition in terms of the zooplanktivorous fish. And then we went into another period, 1983 to 1989, where we had a cryptophyte flagellate era. And here, ammonium became quite a dominant nutrient in the system. Phosphates were still high, but nitrates were reduced. And this resulted in a different zooplankton community, which resulted in a different zooplanktivorous fish component. Then we went into a cyanobacteria era, which is 2000 to 2005. This was similar to the previous one, except now ammonia was becoming even more dominant, and that had another impact on the zooplankton, which had a knock-on effect on the composition of the zooplanktivorous fishes. So you can see that estuaries are dynamic systems, not only on an annual basis, but can also be on a decadal basis, and it can be very quickly responding to changes in nutrient inputs into an estuary, such as the Sacramento, and of course those changes in nutrients are very often driven by us. As I said to you, Peter Moyle, who was the leader of the chapter on non-native fishes, there's not very good data sets from most parts of the world, but the estuaries, and there's a couple of estuaries in California where fairly detailed studies have been done. And here's a good example, which has tracked the system from 1980 to 2018. And you can see that already in 1980, based on catch per unit effort from fish trawls, there was already a very substantial representation of non-native fishes. In other words, in the light blue. The native fishes were at 30. We don't know what the levels were of these fishes in the pristine system. In other words, before there were invasive or non-native fishes. We can only work from 1980 onwards. And you can see that it reached a desperate period in 1994 when the native fishes, I wouldn't say disappeared, but they were pretty close to disappearing. But the non-native fishes also weren't doing very well either in the system. And since 1994, there's actually been a gradual improvement in the composition or the catch per unit effort of the native fishes up until 2018. And the abundance of, or relative abundance of the non-native fishes is quite erratic or fluctuates quite a lot. And you can see there a couple of peaks and troughs. Some of the peaks have been linked to particular introductions of non-native species into the system, but you can see it's not static, it's dynamic and it changes. And it does mean that there's hope for the ultimate recovery of estuaries like this that are affected by non-native fishes. Of course, climate change is also something that's been very much in the limelight in the last decade or so. And much of the writing of this book took place in the last decade. So we really got going with the book in the last decade. The idea for the book was 2 decades ago, and the actual writing of the book took place in the last decade. And this was a chapter led by Bronwyn Galandis from Australia. Nikki was one of the co-authors on that chapter. And this synthesis diagram illustrates the expert opinion as to how the interlinking is going to take place or is taking place between the different changes in rainfall, increased air temperatures, water temperatures, changes in sea level, changes in atmospheric CO2. And there's a lot of projects that are gathering data on all these topics. How these eventually translate to the bottom line, which is shown in this diagram with increased catches or reduced catches or changes in catch composition. At this stage, we can't be certain of a lot of these changes. We've got an idea that this is what's going to happen, and the predictions are based on science that has already been undertaken. And if the response is what we think it will be, those are the likely scenarios that will eventuate, but it's by no means certain that that will take place. And this emphasizes the need for considerable investment in this field of research, because those final lines in this diagram are going to have a significant impact on the fisheries resources that we have in the future. Talking of fisheries, there's a whole chapter on fisheries, obviously, and this shows you the catches in various Greek estuarine lagoons. And again, it only starts in 1975 and goes just to beyond 2000. And it's not a happy picture. It shows declining levels of catches. Obviously, what is not discernible in those various catches is that some species which weren't caught at all in the 1970s and 1980s might now be replaced by other species which were not caught then, but are now being caught in much higher numbers and are not as favored by the fishery as some of the species that have been lost. And this type of graph is repeated in the marine environment as well. So it's something that is concerning. We don't have baselines. So 1979 wasn't the baseline for fish abundance in those Greek lagoons. It would have been wonderful to determine what the catches would have been like before any exploitation of fish had occurred in those lagoons. It could be an order of magnitude higher than what we're seeing in this particular slide. But that's what we've got to work with. That's our baseline. Something that occurred to us more recently and was included in the book and in the conservation sector section led by Paul Cowley, is that some species that are abundant in our estuaries may in future not be abundant, even though they're not major fishery species. They're under pressure. Remember, estuaries in themselves are dynamic environments to start with. And when you impose on top of that major changes, and the pristine conditions, the blue arrows going horizontally indicate that conditions are 100%. They're pristine. And in the pristine conditions, there was no fishing and no pollution. If you go to the present day conditions, the down arrows are becoming increasingly dominant and are very concerning. There's only one arrow going up, and that's piscivory. And the reason why there are less piscivorous fish feeding on this particular sparrid, the Cape Stumpnose, is because those species, those piscivorous species, are in fact being caught by anglers in large numbers, and those populations have been reduced to less than 5% of what they were. So the predation on the Cape Stumpnose would have dropped from that source. But obviously it's been more than compensated by fishing activities. And then the only one that's not going down or up is the spawning, and that is because essentially we don't know where this species spawns. If we did know where it was spawned, it's probable that it would be targeted as a fishery species. And so at the moment, there's only one parallel blue arrow on the present day conditions. Leading up from the knowledge that we've gained about fish, their tolerances, their physiological tolerances, their abundance in under different conditions, we've got to the stage where, particularly in the last 2 decades, where we can use fish as indicators of the health of estuaries. And there have been a proliferation of studies around the world on how we can use fishes to indicate whether systems are in a state of decline or recovery. And this can be conducted at the individual level, the population level, the community level, or a combination of those levels in some cases. And this is going to be most useful in terms of the future, where we will need these sort of indicators in order to determine whether the measures we are undertaking to rehabilitate or reinstate conditions in estuaries that are suitable for the life of most species is being successful or not. This diagram by Mike Elliott is a very important one in this regard, because what it shows is where we started with. The red dot in that diagram is the original condition of most estuaries. And what has happened over the last few decades has been a gradual decline towards the left. In other words, the estuaries are being pushed down the degradation line. But all is not lost. There is a lot of potential for those systems to bounce back. And on the left-hand side there, I've included 2 photographs that are included in the book, showing a recovery of a littoral habitat in an estuary in France, where agricultural land has been rehabilitated back into functional estuary habitat in the lower left-hand corner. And that is quite possible to be done on a wider and wider scale around the world. And my hope is that the next generation of scientists is going to be very active in this particular area, because this is the way in which the productivity, the abundance, the diversity of fish and estuaries is going to improve in the future, not continue to decline, but to actually improve. And we need ways in which to measure that and to actually promote the best methods possible in order to allow for that re-establishment of good conditions in estuaries. And who knows, maybe even some of the systems that are eventually come about are enhancements of what was once present. And maybe climate change will assist in some of these recovery operations. We don't know, but there's certainly a lot of work that can be done in this area. This is the final slide. And what it does is summarize how things have changed. When I first became a scientist working on fish and estuaries, the natural scientists never worked with the social scientists. But what has become apparent as time has gone on is that more and more there's a need for a socio-ecological approach to estuarine conservation and to the way that systems are managed. The two go hand in hand. You cannot deal with either component in isolation, and success will only occur when those two components work closely together. And my hope is that the next generation of scientists in this field will do a lot better at that than my generation of scientists. And on that note, I think there's one more slide. I'd like to say thank you for your attention. For those who are interested, that's the cozy Amatonga fish traps in the cozy estuary, where there's a fishery that has been traditional in that area. It has messages for us. It was a sustainable fishery and had been for generations. And unfortunately, it has become an unsustainable fishery due to commercialization and the introduction of gill netting into the system. But these are not irreversible things. These are things that can be changed. Estuaries are dynamic systems, they're forgiving systems, but we need to do the right things in order to move them back along that path, back to recovery and rehabilitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for giving us a taste of this incredibly comprehensive book. I'm going to jump in with the first question. Alan, you hinted at it, but can you tell us a little bit more about future research directions?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent we were already on that path. In other words, the climate change, which you're very involved with at the moment, is where the future lies. There's no doubt this is happening a lot quicker than we anticipated. And we need to activate research in those particular fields, but we mustn't forget the fundamental aspects that are important. So, for example, eDNA is being widely used now, but people forget that you need the taxonomy and the systematics that describe the actual species that you're finding in the eDNA. So you mustn't put all the research effort and the money and the funding into eDNA work only. You do need to have a balance between the more fundamental and applied research, which has been a message that's carried on for a long period of time. But I think we are getting into a period now where society is having more and more say on the type of research that needs to take place. And we as natural scientists need to respond to those demands and those pressures, because these systems are being subjected to what Mike calls a double whammy. You've got environmental degradation taking place on top of climate change. And the consequences of that are not clearly known and require considerable amount of effort and research in a funding climate globally that is declining, not increasing.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just going to read out a comment first. So Letitia Pierce says very little work on estuaries. So this is a very useful tool to support work done on estuaries in the country and globally. So I don't think that needs an answer. And then Jana said, just curious, why are there so few studies on mangrove fish in South Africa, especially since our mangroves in the Eastern Cape are at the southernmost limit for the distribution, and mangroves are patchy in distribution, making them threatened, yet they are valuable carbon sinks and important in subsistence and commercial fisheries.
Yeah, there has been some work done on mangroves in South Africa, but bear in mind that we are at the edge of the distribution of mangroves. So the really extensive mangroves in the tropics around the world, I would say the effort there has been phenomenal in mangroves in comparison to the edges of where mangroves occur, whether it's in Australia or South Africa. Most of the effort and research on mangroves has been in the center of distribution of where the mangroves occur. And in those areas, they are absolutely extensive and vital to the functioning of systems in those areas. Not to the same extent in South Africa, because as I say, they are relatively marginal systems, and in some systems, there are only small patches of mangroves present.
Thank you, Alan. And then Paul Skelton said that recent floods in KZN were pretty impressive. The estuaries look to be cleaned out by fresh water and its load. So what happens to the fishes? How quickly is a norm re-established?
Okay, the work that Hannes Marais did in the Swartkops and the Sundays was quite an interesting one in terms of the rapidity with which the recolonization of the estuary occurred after a flood. And we know from other studies as well that estuarine-associated species move back into the estuary relatively quickly after a flood. So the flood is very important from a resetting perspective in terms of the morphometry of the estuary, in other words, increasing the depth of the estuary, getting rid of sediment from the estuary. And then you get a long period of equilibration or re-establishment of the system until the next flood occurs. And estuaries are dynamic systems, and it's part of their makeup to be able to adapt to these seemingly extreme events. But in the life of a fish in an estuary, that's not an extreme event. It's an event that is going to happen and that you're going to be subjected to that event, and you're adapted to it. So fish are adapted to these major floods, and they do bounce back very quickly.
Thank you, Alan. And then Gideon Wide, sorry if I've got your surname wrong, said, thanks, Alan, for a very interesting talk. I have a few questions specifically related to the Blaber River estuary. My family has been going there for over 60 years. It has been interesting to personally experience changes in the abundance of different fish species there. How does the presence of bull sharks influence estuarine health and fish abundance? There has been a steady increase in shark presence in the Blaber River over the past 30 years. How can locals in the Blaber River estuary contribute or get involved in any of the research or conservation efforts? There are several families who have been living there for over 60 years, and they could contribute from their own experiences over the years. The Western Cape Government Environmental Affairs has started with a management plan for the Blaber River. In the public commenting stage, it seemed that several proposals were not based on or referred to solid research. How can research like this influence or provide inputs to the plan?
Okay, Steve Lambert is very involved in fish research on the Blaber estuary and has been for a number of years. So he's certainly the person who could provide detailed information on the fish of that system, and he's in fact published a number of papers on the fish in that system. The increase in, or possible increase in bull sharks in the Blaber is an interesting one. Maybe that's also another indication of climate change. The bull shark is a predominantly tropical, subtropical species, and the fact that they are increasing in the Blaber estuary suggests that maybe climate change is happening a lot faster than we thought. Obviously, the impact of anglers is quite important, and I know in the Blaber, the relationship between the dusky cob and angling is a vital one in terms of the future of those stocks in the system. But the Blaber estuary in itself is one of the critical estuarine systems along the whole South African coast. Thank
you, Alan. And sorry, I just lost it. And Bernard says, thanks, Alan. Just before your last slide, I was wondering about your thoughts on social ecological system research in promoting sustainability and stewardship. Do you think there is scope for co-management and or self-regulation by resource users to improve estuary condition? And what challenges do you foresee?
I think we're already in the midst of all those points that Ant has raised. In other words, there are studies that have been undertaken following that type of method, that type of approach with co-management. It's worked in some cases, it hasn't worked in other cases. So we are still on a learning curve. But there's no doubt in my mind that we have to go down that route in the future, because that is the way we are going to turn the clock back in terms of degradation and so on, and get back to a point where we improve the productivity, the biodiversity, the conservation of systems for all. And by all, we're talking not only the natural inhabitants of these systems, but for people. It's just the way we have to learn and to educate. And to do that, we need information and the right sort of information. And I think that's where we need to be guided more by what society wants, because the sort of information we feed them at the end of the day needs to be informed by the type of answers they want. And I think that was epitomized by the early days when we were asked questions about the nursery function of estuaries. How important are estuaries as nursery areas for fish, which are subsequently used by both recreational and subsistence fishermen? And only by doing certain types of research can you answer that question, but you're informed by the question to start with. And the same needs to take place in terms of what society is looking for in terms of estuarine research.
And then Alex Weaver said, thanks, Alan, congratulations on all involved on the publication. Good to see the social ecological shift. And a question from Matthew Dooley. He said, hi, Alan. With regards to the restoration of estuaries, has there been significant degradation of primary estuarine habitats, seagrasses, mangroves, etc. in South Africa? Or would you say that the major threat to our systems is overfishing?
I think all of the above. There's no doubt that some of the plant habitats have been substantially influenced by human development. Salt marshes in particular have been affected significantly by human habitation around estuaries like Knysna, for example, where many salt marshes have been removed because they are not perceived to be important to the estuary or to the organisms living in the estuary. And with sea level changes, that could become even more of a problem. There's no doubt that overfishing is a huge problem as well. So habitat degradation, which is still taking place, but can be reversed, overfishing are probably two of the primary causes of concern around the health of estuaries in South Africa and elsewhere, not just in South Africa.
Nina de Villiers asks, she says there are several estuaries that have very few studies targeting them. Is there any suggestion for how we can improve the focus on these areas?
Often you find that the focus on a system from a research perspective originates out of certain things happening, and sometimes where a university is situated, the estuaries that are close to the university are often the target of research. But if you take St. Lucia, for example, it was as a result of the hypersaline conditions in the late 1950s, 1960s that led to a major escalation in research at St. Lucia, which carried through for decades. That research now has died down and is not prevalent. It needs another stimulus to get it going again, given the new circumstances that are taking place there. But if you take a system like the Bot estuary near Cape Town, and the University of Cape Town did an amazing amount of research on that estuary because it was relatively close to the university in terms of access. It was an ideal place for students to do postgraduate degrees. And so the estuaries that have been selected for intensive study are often, there's circumstances around each of them which have resulted in a focus being established on those particular systems.
Thanks, Alan. Judy Mann says, fascinating presentation. Thank you, Alan. For young scientists who want to work on the social and economic aspects of estuaries, what would you advise? Where are the opportunities opening up now?
I think people who can be cross-cutters, and in other words, they have expertise in both the social sciences and the natural sciences are going to do best, because they can pull together teams. And I think the team approach is the way to go. In other words, you have experts in the natural sciences and the social sciences, but they're brought together under an umbrella and a leader who perhaps has skills in both areas. And those will be the most successful studies that will be undertaken, rather than natural scientists just doing natural science, social scientists doing social sciences, and then hoping that the two aspects can be drawn together towards the end into a cohesive whole. I think the planning needs to take place right at the beginning, and the way plotted in a way which fosters collaboration and the meeting of the different types of science.
Thanks, Alan. Matthew Dooley says it would be interesting to consider the potential for these habitats in the voluntary carbon market.
Agreed. I think with climate change taking place and global change, there's no doubt that the value of habitats such as mangroves and salt marshes and seagrasses, which are highly productive systems on a unit area basis, will play a significant role in carbon budgets and balances going forward. And maybe we need to market estuaries more strongly in the whole carbon budget of the world. I mean, a concern, and it's expressed in this book, is the decline, for example, in seagrasses around the world in the last century. It's frightening, the loss of seagrasses that has taken place. And even our seagrass that we get in estuaries in South Africa, the Cape seagrass Zostricapensis, is declining. It's not increasing, it's declining. And part of the reason for that is bait exploitation and the consequences of that on seagrass beds. So we need to be aware of the ramifications of our activities on these potential earners of carbon offsets and so on, that currently we're not capitalizing on.
Thanks, Alan. I also think blue carbon is a major focus of Professor Janine Adams and Laura van Niekerk's
Yes.
work now. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And then let me just see if I've. Sean Ecote says, Alan, do you think that Notake marine reserve concept is appropriate and necessary for estuary conservation?
Yeah, this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. There's no doubt that in order for proper conservation to take place, you have to have some no-take areas. At the moment, we've got areas like St. Lucia where everybody fishes. It's not like you go into the Kruger Park and start shooting impala. You should have areas where fishing is not permitted and where the nursery function of the estuary is fully respected. And so no-take areas which are easy to administer are one of the tools, one of the arrows that I think is important in the conservation bow. And it needs to be expanded beyond where it is at the moment if we're going to have species like the dusky cob, like the white steenbrush, actually recover back to levels that approach the levels of 30, 40 years ago when they were already heavily exploited, but are now totally overexploited. So yes, no-take areas are required, but it's very difficult to implement because the area where you implement a no-take zone has a direct impact on the people in that area. And in other areas where fishing is allowed, and there's no no-take zones, that inequitable allocation of resources and legislation can lead to unhappiness. But I think what we should be looking at is the greater good of all. In other words, not just short-term, but long-term benefits for everyone.
Thank you, Alan. And then Cornelius Landa asks, how is climate change affecting biodiversity in ecosystems?
Well, in the case of South Africa, the tropical species are probably going to expand southwards towards the southwest, and estuaries, which are today dominated by predominantly warm temperate and endemic species, may be pushed further to the west. That is going to have a negative impact on the richness of the temperate species, but it's going to have a positive effect on the tropical species. So but some species are going to win and others are going to lose. And so it's not a simple answer. You need to look in the context of different groups of species and clusters of species as to how they're going to be affected by climate change. And it's not a linear relationship, and it's not a uniform relationship between the different groups.
Thank you. And then Lucian Human asks, how do we communicate the importance of our systems to decision makers, effectively bridging the science policy gap? What are some of your lessons learned?
I don't think we were involved enough in the past. I know I wasn't. In my retirement, I'm now involved with St. Lucia in a voluntary capacity. And I think more of that needs to be done, because one realizes very quickly that the information that we have is absolutely vital to proper management of these systems. And we, in the past, have not been as involved as we should have been. Whether that was because we weren't invited into joint management in the way that we should have, or whether we didn't put our hands up enough in order to get involved, I'm not quite sure. Could have been a bit of both. But there's no doubt in my mind that scientists need, and it's critical, that we do become more involved in management issues and conservation issues that are not directly research as such, but require information from research.
Thanks, Alan. Mike Elliott says, great talk, Alan, thanks. If we have Notake estuaries, then does that mean we need a national estuarine strategy where some are industrialized and some are kept pristine, or can we allow a bit of everything elsewhere? Sorry, of everything everywhere?
I think the reality is that in most parts of the world, there are many systems, estuarine systems, that have already been industrialized. And it will be almost impossible to turn back the clock in those systems completely, or even partially. So we need to do an inventory, whether it's on a country by country basis, I don't know, but whereby you decide which of where do you put your resources in terms of recovery, reestablishment, and where do you say, look, we can pour a lot of money into this system, but it isn't going to make much difference to the biodiversity of estuarine biota in this part of the world. So I think the choice of systems and where you invest your effort is going to be quite important going forward.
Thank you, Alan. And then Nokobonga Mbanzi, one of your past students, says, many thanks for your talk, Alan. I was wondering how significant is the impact of the tidal regime on the salt marsh and seagrass?
Well, tidal regime is absolutely critical to salt marshes and to seagrass. And in fact, where you don't have a tidal regime, in other words, where the estuary is closed for years, those habitats tend to disappear, and mangrove habitats as well. So tidal regime, which doesn't occur in all estuaries in South Africa, it's only present in the permanently open estuaries, is absolutely vital. However, what we need to realize is that with sea level rise, those tidal exchanges are going to change, and that is going to have an impact on those habitats that have been mentioned.
Thanks, Alan. And the two questions about where people can buy the book or get the book from.
If you go to the Wiley website, it is available there. There's an electronic version and a hard copy version. The price is rather high, in my opinion, but we had nothing to do with the pricing of the book. So I would say mostly institutions are going to be the ones getting the book. And here at SAIAB, I know they will be purchasing a copy. I'm not sure whether it's both electronic and hard copy. Hopefully it will be. And so students and lecturers here would be able to access the book through the SAIAB library, the university library, and I'm sure in other universities as well. The book should be available through universities, but it is an expensive book. I think the hard copy price is 350 UK pounds, and the electronic copy is just over 300 pounds.
Sure. And then Matsubane Malabaka says, hello, Alan, it's refreshing to hear a socio-ecological aspect integration, as the sociological part is essential in the efficiency of regulations and policies by compliance, when especially coastal communities are involved and understand aims and purpose.
I fully concur.
And then last question, I think. Jim McCafferty says, hi, Alan, fascinating talk. Over the course of your career, have you seen any meaningful increase in political and public awareness of the importance and often plight of our estuaries?
I think it depends on individuals. There's some individuals in positions of power who are aware, but there are a lot that are not. And it's only when issues arise that, I don't want to say hit the political landscape, that things start happening from high levels. So for example, the controversial opening of the St. Lucia estuary in January of last year resulted in the Minister of Environment Affairs appointing a panel to investigate the reason why it was undertaken, why the opening was undertaken, and whether it's desirable for the future. If that hadn't happened, it would have, St. Lucia would have been on a lower level of concern. But because of what happened, suddenly it was thrust into the limelight, and particularly because it's a World Heritage Site as well. So then it has ramifications globally as to how we're looking after this World Heritage Site. So I would say the involvement of politicians in particular, and at cabinet minister or parliamentary level, often is driven by circumstances and events, whether it's flooding in KwaZulu-Natal, where the focus then becomes, well, what's happening to the estuaries, in these floods, or whether it's St. Lucia with artificial breaching. So a lot depends on individual circumstances as to what level of perception there is around the issues, estuarine issues there are.
Thank you, Alan. I'm just looking through the chat. There's a question about what can we do to stop climate change?
What's it, keep the temperature increase below, what's it, 1.5 or something in the next 100 years or whatever. Look, it's almost, the climate change is happening and it's going to take place. I think it's just a question of magnitude. The more we do and act now, the more moderate the climate change is likely to be. The less we do now and in the future, the more extreme things are going to be. And I don't think we fully understand the extreme levels that could arise. In other words, we've got projections, but I think they're conservative, personally. But science in the future will be able to show whether the estimates were correct or not.
Thank you, Alan. And then I'm just looking to see comments. Mike Elliott said, one continued future direction is more work on functioning of systems, whereas we started by focusing on structure of systems, the links to the resilience of systems. Yes,
determining structure is the first step in many studies. The difficult part, and you'll recall that diagram I showed you with all the influences that impinge on what is taking place in the estuary, that is what influences functioning. And at the end of the day, that is really what we want to know about. We want to know about the functioning of these systems and how they're going to respond to changing circumstances in time, global change. How is it going to affect these systems? And to do that, you need an enormous amount of information, investment. And what concerns me is that level of investment that is required to provide the answers to functioning is not always there, and I'm concerned that it's getting even less.
Thank you so much, Alan. I can't see unless I've missed any more questions. Thank you so much for your really interesting presentation.
And thank you for chairing the session.
Thank you.